Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the 21st installment of our monthly post-2020 webinars. As I mentioned, this is the 21st webinar in the series of webinars where we discuss everything biodiversity, nature and cities related, essentially building up to COP15 in China, which was scheduled for late last year, but for obvious reasons had to be moved out a bit. So yeah, welcome to our old faces, but also a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us to new faces. We see there's a lot of new faces joining us for the first time today, so we're quite excited to broaden the scope of these webinars. So as I mentioned, this is part two of our webinars for today. So we had a morning session earlier today, which was very well attended and very well received. And as I mentioned, this is a monthly webinar series where we discuss nature and biodiversity at the local and subnational levels. And the focus for today, we're going to be looking at rebalancing our economy with nature. So we have a very exciting all-woman panelist that's going to speak to us today. So just a special word of thanks for the people at Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework EU support for making this webinar and the entire series possible. And as always, a very big word of thanks to our partners on the Global Task Force for Local and Regional Governments, as you can see on the screen. So as always, ICLEI can't do this work alone, so we rely heavily on partnerships and working with these great organizations towards realizing this new global nature agenda. So as I mentioned earlier, this specific webinar forms part of a series of webinars. This is the 21st one that's being held, part two of the 21st webinar series. And really, as I mentioned, it happens once a month. The next one scheduled for the 1st of April, so very soon. And just also to mention that all these webinars are recorded. So if you do want to catch up on previous webinars, or even on this morning session, these will be uploaded onto the website, and the link you can see on your screen right now. So please do, if you are interested to catch up, please do follow the link to those webinars. So just the agenda for today. So as I mentioned, we have a very cool panel that's speaking to us today, and we're gonna, for those of you that's new to this process, Ingrid will give a little bit of a snapshot and overview of why we're doing this and where we are in the process. Then we're going to look at a little bit of finance in the biodiversity space, and just looking at really from a bird's eye view. And then Nakara is going to share some insights on the Dasgupta publication. Then we're going to look at resource mobilization at the local and subnational level, and then finally some reflections from Kobi, our regional director, on rebalancing our economy with nature. And if there is time permitting, hopefully we'll take some questions and answers at a later stage before we do close the webinar. Before we do dive in, just some housekeeping rules. So as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. So by participating, you are giving consent. We hope that won't be a problem. And as I said, this webinar will be uploaded, the recording of the webinar will be uploaded to our various platforms and YouTube as well. So you are more than welcome to share that links with your peers for catching up. Then just to ensure to those of you that are familiar with Zoom, so at the taskbar at the bottom, there's a Q&A function. So please do make use of the Q&A function to shoot off any questions that you may have for any of our speakers. As I mentioned, we'll have a question and answers session towards the end of the webinar, time permitting, but please do interact with our speakers using the Q&A. And if you want to introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from. Yeah, if you want to make any general questions or remarks, or spark a conversation, or share any links to resources or materials, you're more than welcome to also use the chat facility. So we do encourage you to please engage and make this session as interactive as possible. So just for the session for today, I'm Ryan Fisher. I'm a professional officer at Italy's Cities Biodiversity Center. So I'm based at our Africa Secretariat all the way down in Cape Town. And I am joined by our Director for Biodiversity, Nature and Health, Ingrid Kutsia. Then we will also be recording. Corby unfortunately can't join us for this afternoon session, but we did record her inputs from this morning session, so we'll play that recording a little bit later. But as you might be aware, Corby is obviously our Deputy Secretary General at Italy Global, but she's also the Global Director for the Italy's Cities Biodiversity Center, as well as wearing the hat of Regional Director for Italy Africa. So many as the, and we always welcome Corby's inputs into these webinars. And then Ms. Nakada Mahadio is also a PO at Italy Cities Biodiversity Center, is going to share some insights around biodiversity finance. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid, our first speaker. Who's going to just take us along this journey, show us the roadmap towards COP15, and then also just some key updates from some key events, and also more importantly, what's in the pipeline going forward. So thank you, Ingrid, for your time. Over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and you can take to the next slide. And while you do that, just to tell colleagues that are joining us today and attendees that are new to this webinar series is that ICLEI has been advocating for the voice of local and subnational governments to be heard and recognized and optimized in the global biodiversity agenda for more than a decade now. For example, we have run a series of global biodiversity summits for cities and subnational governments that are held as official parallel events to the biodiversity COPs every second year when the COP is held. And the first of that was in 2008. And we're heading for our 7th one, which will be the end of this year in China. And also together with our partners, Regions for the group of leading subnational governments, as well as the European Committee on the Regions and the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments. We in the 14th COP in Egypt took up the challenge to participate and to mobilize local and subnational governments to participate in the CBD post-2020 process. And one of the things that we have done as a result of that has been to start these monthly webinars. We've also been very instrumental together with the Government of Scotland in organizing the Edinburgh process. And we've got a website and Tamlin will put the website up. The website is shared with our partners. So there's a lot of ways in which we've been engaging with local and subnational governments and also sharing information. So if you go to the next slide, thanks, Ryan. Just very quickly to say that what we're going to be doing this week, obviously you can see on that slide progression there that we're building up to COP at the end of the year, and there's a series of major meetings coming up. But there's also the launch of the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is going to be happening. The big launch event will be on World Environment Day. And we will, as the year progresses, we will on a monthly basis provide updates and news, etc. And then we do also have thematic discussions such as the one today on the very important issue of finance. Next slide, please, Ryan. So I think what is important in terms of the update this month is just to report back on the informal session for the science subsidiary body on science, technology and advice to the CBD, which took place in February. These are being virtual sessions focused towards parties as well as major groups, and ICLEI obviously represents the local and subnational government within the major groups, and there are other observers as well, such as NGOs, etc. And the idea of these informal sessions has been to prepare towards the main meeting, the SABSTA meeting, which will be taking place later this year, but also to maintain momentum towards the COP. Obviously, it's really difficult within these times to maintain that momentum. And although these are not formal negotiation meetings and there are no decisions taken, there are statements being made by the parties and the major groups, etc. And those statements obviously are important, and they do sort of show the direction in which the policy debates are going. So ICLEI and its network partners, the ones I mentioned just now, participated in the SABSTA meeting earlier, well, towards the end of February. And we made a joint submission and joint statement on behalf of local and subnational governments, which spoke specifically to the issue of scientific and technical information in support of reviewing goals and targets, indicators and baselines. And the link to, if you want to see what that statement says, the link is there in the chat box. And in this particular case, our statement was read by a member from Regions 4, and we do share the burden of reading the statements. It's also uploaded on the CBD website. Next slide, please. So the next meeting that's going to be held is actually taking place next week. And that is the implementation sessions, the subsidiary body on implementation. And we again will be attending together with our network partners to represent the ambitions and interests of local and subnational governments. And we are, as I speak, preparing various statements, joint statements. For example, there will be one on resource mobilization, and capacity building, mechanisms for reporting, reviewing and assessment of the implementation of the new framework, and also around biodiversity mainstreaming. And once these statements have been held, we will again post them on the Nature Advocacy website. But what we have provided in the slide is just the references to the CBD documents that are under discussion in these various meetings. And if you can take me to the next slide, what I would like to just share with everybody, because this is really big news, is that there will also be a document discussed at the SBI meeting under item 11, which deals with mainstreaming and other strategic actions. And that has to do with the very important topic of engagement with subnational governments, cities and other local authorities to enhance the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, those of you that have been following this series and also participated in the Edinburgh process will remember that this was something that was discussed around replacing and renewing the current plan of action, which was adopted in 2010 in Nagoya, and comes to an end, in fact, has already come to an end because it ended last year. And the cities and local and subnational governments felt that there is definitely very strong motivation and ambition to have a renewed and far more ambitious decision and plan of action. So coming out of the Edinburgh process, the government of Scotland has, together with the government of the United Kingdom, has made a submission to have this discussed at the SABSTA meetings starting then next week. The next slide, please. And then there are also various documents that have been posted, and these are available for review. The comments are all due by 22 March. And the one deals with scientific and technical information to support the goals and targets. Then there's one on the a new post-2020 gender plan of action. Also aligned to the updated zero draft. And finally, there's one, and this one was actually only made available yesterday. And it's an important one because it's a draft global action plan for biodiversity and health. And this speaks specifically to the linkages between health and biodiversity to ensure that we can achieve the vision of living in harmony with nature. So there's a lot of really interesting policy debates going on, and I would encourage everybody to visit the website, the CBD website, and have a look at that. And then if we move to the next slide, moving away from the CBD related process, more just to give some quick feedback on a very important meeting that took place towards the end of February, was the United Nations Environmental Assembly 5th session. As a result of the pandemic, the UNEA meeting has also had to be done online, and they're doing it in different parts. So we had UNEA 5.1, which is the first part. And the focus of that was to look at the medium-term strategy for the period 2022 to 25 and its associated program of work. And in that meeting, there were also from UNEA 5 sort of highlights of the 3 major environmental crises that UNEP is committed to addressing. And you will see there again the issue of biodiversity loss and climate change and pollution. And then just to say that what was so interesting, we participated, ICLEI participated in this. We represent local and subnational governments in the major groups and stakeholder forum, was that the topic of animal health and human health, ecosystem restoration, and recognition of the importance of multi-level governance, and the fact that the subnational levels of government play a very important role. There's quite a robust a number of provisions and recommendations in the new MTS. So that's great to know that the role of our constituency is being recognized. At the high level leadership dialogue, again, the focus on health and human health, and the link between nature, climate, and pollution. My next slide, please, and I think that's going to be then my last slide for a while, is just to look beyond the sort of UN family and to show that there's been a lot of action also. Those of you that joined our Feb webinar will remember that we opened this year with a very youthful focus, and we had the Global Youth Biodiversity Network participate in our webinar. So they've got some more things coming up, some training later in March this month. And there's also going to be intergenerational dialogues. So it's not just the young people, it's the young and other generations speaking on Earth Hour on the 27th. And then ICLEI just participated in the Nature of Cities Festival, which took place last week, at the end of February. It was a virtual festival. And we had a very successful session on finance. We had some development banks and institutions and the World Economic Forum participating and specifically looking at how cities can access funding. So we will post as soon as we get the links to the recordings, we will post those as well as on our websites. And then, of course, there was a dialogue with some experts on what it is that urban biodiversity needs to be doing for the new biodiversity framework and how we can specifically accomplish that in cities. And with that, I will end, because I think that's the end of my presentation for now. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Ingrid. And yeah, thanks for setting the scene for us. A lot of information to take in, but I think you did a good job at summarizing it for everyone. So just a reminder, I see Tamlin has been sharing the links to some of the events and documentation that has been alluded to. So please do find them there and access the relevant information via those links. But as always, if there are any additional questions or points of clarity, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us at ICLEI, and we'll be happy to provide clarity and to bring you on board. So thanks again for that, Ingrid. We're going to move on now and talk a little bit about biodiversity finance. So I'm going to call upon Nakara Mahadio to just share some thoughts with us on that topic. So Nakara, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you everyone for joining us wherever you may be in the world. Today I'm here just to give you some perspective on what biodiversity finance really is. I think just an upfront disclaimer, I'm by no means an economist and no means an expert in this field, but here just to share some of my understanding of what biodiversity finance is with all of you. So on to the next slide. Thanks, Ryan. So according to the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, biodiversity finance is the practice of raising and managing capital and using financial incentives to support the sustainable management of biodiversity. So in simple terms, it is essentially the money that we raise and that we accrue in order to protect nature and to prevent biodiversity loss. And the sources of these finances can be both in two predominant forms, and that's the private sector, such as from businesses or corporates, and the public sector, which is primarily from government budgets. But why is biodiversity finance so important? Well, some of you might have heard that biodiversity loss is one of the major threats to our global economy, and this has both been recognized by IPBES and the World Economic Forum. And I think in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, biodiversity has become central to our economic recovery as we move towards a post-pandemic world. The next slide, please, Ryan. So just looking at the term biodiversity finance, it's not something new, it's not a new field of research. It's been ongoing for a number of decades. And one of the first recognized global valuations of natural assets or natural capital was done in the mid-1990s. But it was around about 2010 when the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or better known as TEEB, was released. And this really started a snowball effect in terms of looking at biodiversity finance. And fast forward over this last decade, there have been a number of reports, manuals, handbooks, and guidelines that have come out, and you see this in the middle of the screen. But I think what we're really focusing on today, and what has recently been released, is the Dasgupta review. And I'd like to share some of the key messages or key insights that have come out of this review recently. So next slide, please, Ryan. And these are, firstly, that our economies, livelihoods, and well-being depend on nature. So just like how we have produced capital, which could be roads, buildings, the infrastructure, and how we've developed human capital, which is our health, knowledge, and skills, nature is also capital to us. And it's not only producing value or assets for us, but it also has an intrinsic value. So there's cultural, spiritual, and other values that nature provides to humanity. But the real problem is that we've failed to engage with nature sustainably. And our current demand for nature services is completely outstripped by the supply of what it's able to produce for us. And the production of human and produced capital over the last couple of decades has come at the great expense of nature. So it's critical that we act now rather than later in terms of protecting nature and preventing the further loss of biodiversity. And one of the problems with regard to this sustainable use of nature is rooted in institutional failure. So nature is not reflected in market values, and it's often underinvested, natural assets are often underinvested in. And it's not easy to reflect the value of nature in our economic markets, but we need to start thinking about how we do that. This has been exacerbated by governments as well, which have increased the problem by paying people to exploit nature. And just to put it into some facts and figures, the conservative estimate out of the Dasgupta review says that the total cost globally for subsidies that damage nature is between 4 to 6 trillion US dollars per year. So I'd like you to just keep these numbers in mind. A little bit later on, I'm going to be showing you some graphs of what we're actually contributing towards nature at the moment. So there's a need for us to transform the way in which we value nature and the way that our economic systems are currently operating. And one of the ways we can start doing that is by recognizing that economies are embedded in nature. We need to fully account for the impact that we are having on nature and start thinking about how do we rebalance the demand and supply and these supplies that nature really gives us. So just again, to quote another figure, is that approximately 44 trillion US dollars of our global GDP is dependent on nature and its services. So these are very big numbers, and again, just bear this in mind when I show you some graphs about what we're really contributing towards biodiversity loss and protection of nature. So what do we need to do? We need to change how we think, act, and measure success. And there's three broad areas of transition that we need to focus on. And these are demands, that we ensure that demands do not exceed the supply. The second is looking at different measures of economic success. And just to elaborate a little bit more on this, is that GDP does not account for the depreciation of our natural assets. So we need a more inclusive measure of wealth and economic prosperity. And an example of this is natural capital accounting. I'll talk to this a little bit later on. And the third is looking at transformation in our institutions and systems, and in particular, looking at the finance and education systems, because these are critical in ensuring and supporting that sustainable engagement with nature as we move forward. On to the next slide, please. So looking at these graphs, the one on the left-hand side is looking at what we're actually contributing towards the protection of biodiversity and nature and preventing biodiversity loss. And considering the amounts that I quoted a little bit earlier, if you look at the figure in the middle of the pie chart on the left-hand side, it shows that global financial flows into biodiversity are currently at a point where we're only contributing between 124 to 143 billion US dollars. And I think even if you can't remember the exact figures, what I've quoted earlier, I think the difference there is even just thinking we are putting trillions of dollars towards damaging nature, but only billions of dollars towards actually protecting it. And looking at the graph on the right-hand side of the screen and the figure that's quoted in red, it's estimated between now and 2030, we are going to need between 722 to 967 billion US dollars in order to protect and prevent biodiversity loss, protect nature and prevent biodiversity loss. So there's a massive gap between what we currently are contributing towards the conservation of biodiversity and what we are actually needing. So we need to look at mechanisms and solutions of how we start closing this gap. So on to the next slide, please, Ryan. So before I get on to looking at some of these mechanisms and solutions, I first want to focus in on cities and our urban environments and still consider what is needed in terms of managing these urban environments. So based on management of nature within our cities, it's estimated that we're going to need around $73 billion a year to manage nature and to protect nature that's within our cities. And keep this in mind as cities are growing with constant urban expansion and what is expected and anticipated by 2030. The other point that I'd like to raise around cities is that there are actually engines of economic growth around the world, and they contribute approximately 85% of a global GDP. So there's real opportunity for cities to also generate the financial flows that we need to protect nature. And I think as cities look to shift towards a carbon neutral economy, we need to start looking at effective ways of generating the finance that we need for nature. So maybe just to reiterate, there's really two roles here for cities in terms of biodiversity finance. The first being that they need to be able to protect nature and manage nature within their boundaries, but they also need to look at ways to generate the financial flows to protect nature beyond their boundaries. On to the next slide, please. So financial flows and financial mechanisms have definitely developed over the last decades, and there are a wide range of financing instruments that are available to us. And BioFin, organization that I mentioned to you earlier, they've created a catalog of some of these financial solutions. There are an array of public and private solutions, and they've identified 68 of these solutions in their catalog. And there's a diversity of these financial solutions, and they've categorized them as different types. They being debt and equity, fiscal, grants, market, regulatory, or risk management. And all of these solutions can be used independently or used in combination to increase impact in terms of biodiversity protection or interventions to prevent loss of biodiversity. And some of these examples you may have heard of: the biodiversity offsets, conservation easements, corporate social responsibility, payment for ecosystem services. So they are mechanisms, they are solutions, but it's not a cut and paste type of solution. There obviously has to be adapted based on the scenario and the situation. But I think the real key message is that we need to start looking at what these solutions are and start to adapt them so that they can start working and we can start really focusing on the generation of finances for biodiversity. On to the next slide, please, Ryan. So I mentioned natural capital accounting a little bit earlier, and some countries have undertaken this task. And really, to just explain what it is, it's a tool to help measure the full extent of a country's natural assets. And it's calculated on the total stocks of natural resources and the services within a given ecosystem or region. And it really creates a link between the economy and the environment. So if you look at the diagram on the slide, it shows that we have stocks or natural capital, and that's really looking at what is available to us. How does this generate into flows in terms of the ecosystem services, and what is the economic value of that to society? There are various frameworks and natural capital accounting and assessments that exist, and all at different stages of development. And there has been some criticism around this, and problems and designs that have undergone through this process. But it shouldn't deter governments and businesses from embracing this approach. It would make it easier to start embedding our natural assets within our economic accounts, and it will also improve decision making. So on to the next slide, please, Ryan. So lastly, I'd like you to think about the different strategies in terms of the current situation that we're in. And the Biodiversity Finance Initiative have identified 4 main areas that we need to really focus on in terms of effectively unlocking finance for biodiversity protection. And the first is generating revenue. So looking at mechanisms like some of the solutions that I just mentioned that can generate and leverage additional financial resources for biodiversity. The second is realigning current expenditures. So looking at what are our budgets right now and how can we redirect some of what we've got already to biodiversity protection and preventing further biodiversity loss. And this is really looking at stopping the harmful activities and the activities that damage our biodiversity. The last is looking at, the third, not the last, is looking to avoid the need for future expenditures. So again, also looking at these perverse incentives, but finding measures that we can use to prevent or reduce any further harm that we are doing to nature and anything that might be counterproductive to protecting nature. And lastly, it's looking at delivering biodiversity management effort more effectively. So looking at what we've got in terms of capacity and resources, and how can we actually put that towards being more effective? Where are the synergies? Where is the opportunity to be cost effective? And really look at focusing on protecting nature and being more effective at doing that. And a way of doing that is really, or at least all these steps, is really creating a business case for biodiversity. And the little flow diagram at the bottom of the screen is just outline some of the steps we need to make in order to create a sound business case for biodiversity. It's often a difficult concept to communicate, particularly to businesses or others that are not familiar with the terms that we generally use. But if we're able to actually prove and show that the tangible benefits of investing in biodiversity can have really great outcomes, then that's when we are winning and when we are able to actually generate the finances that we need. And it's important that we structure this in an effective way that allows people to see the value in investing in biodiversity. And with that, thank you.
Thanks so much, Nakora, for those great insights. Yeah, really concerning when one thinks about the gap between the nature destruction compared to the actual investment into nature. I think it's quite concerning. But I think on the other hand, it's also, like you mentioned, opportunities within our cities, to create those enabling environments. And I think this report, as we can see on this last slide, actually give a framework on how we can start to do a lot of those things. So I think that's great, and it really feeds quite nicely into our next presentation, where we're going to have Ingrid back to talk a little bit around resource mobilization at the local and subnational level. So great, Ingrid, over to you.
Thank you. So my slides are not going to be as interesting as Nikara's, but in a sense, what this does is to look at how many of these concepts and also the policy discussions that are being held globally, and some of the recommendations that have been made through the Dasgupta review are finding traction in the debate around how to deal with resource mobilization in the new global biodiversity framework, and then to try and just focus a little bit on what it means for subnational and local governments. So the first thing to give is just some background, and to say that the whole thing about resource mobilization through the post-2020 process was dealt through a panel of experts, which the CBD established. And they had to cover three main topics. They needed to do a bit of a sort of a stock take, a review on the current strategy. And then they needed to look at the estimation of costs or benefits and those sorts of things. So these are many of the rather scary figures that Nikara was sharing with you earlier. And then finally, and probably one of the most important things, was to come up with a draft, a resource mobilization component. How would it look going forward? What do we need to do? And going through, and there are many documents that they've generated, and going through all of their reports and the recommendations, it's clear that while initially there was no mention of cities and subnational governments, in the later versions, particularly looking at the contribution or the proposals for resource mobilization in the post-2020 framework, that there are clear references to local and subnational governments. And it addresses many of the issues that came out through the Edinburgh process. But I do think, and I'm sure that many of you will agree with me, is that it has a long way to go. We could get a lot more specific and a lot more ambitious. My next slide, please. So there is a huge amount of information in all these reports, but I thought the things that were interesting and relevant to this audience is the fact that they talk about effective resource mobilization, and that's something that Nikara was mentioning in one of her last slides. And they talk about transformative, inclusive, and equitable change across all economies and society. And they've identified three, what they call their sort of interconnected and complementary components. The one looks at reduce or redirect resources that cause harm to biodiversity. And this speaks to the sort of harmful subsidies and bringing in disincentives and things like that. Also something that Nikara mentioned, if we're wanting to change the way in which our economies work, to be a more nature positive and nature friendly type of economy. Then obviously there is the issue of generating additional resources from all sources, and again speaks to a lot of the sentiments that Nikara mentioned. And finally, the important issue of effectiveness and efficiency of resource use. And this is important because when one talks about efficiency and effectiveness, if you go down to the local level, that's where you can get your greatest efficiency gains. So I think the other thing the last point, and then you can move to the next slide, Ryan, is the fact that the recommendations as such covers all of the sectors, but particularly also all levels of government. So it's not just at the national level. Next slide, thanks, Ryan. And I think then probably one of the last main messages that comes out of those documents is the fact that mainstreaming is seen as a fundamental approach and crucial to achieving this sort of whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach, or the sort of theory of change that's being adopted in the global biodiversity framework. And here again, there's issues around looking at the value of biodiversity at all levels, looking at the contribution that biodiversity and ecological infrastructure or green infrastructure or whatever you want to call it can make to achieving in real tangible terms and on the ground, achieving the objectives and targets of the UNFCCC, the Sendai framework and the SDGs. And then this last point about natural capital accounts, looking at the uptake of those sorts of ecosystem account systems across not just government, but certainly also within the private sector. To inform decision making and so that we can really internalize the real costs of many of these benefits that we do get for free from nature. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, the first component which speaks to reducing and redirecting resources that cause harm to biodiversity. Again, the focus on all government budgets and looking at reforms or incentives to address these. Scaling up disincentives for actions that harm biodiversity and incentives that would encourage biodiversity positive actions. There's a whole lot more detail, but I'm not going to go into that now. Next slide. The second one, I think, around generating additional resources. The important one here is how can we use our existing expenditures and budgets to be more biodiversity focused and friendly. And there, for example, things like budgets for water and sanitation and disaster risk reduction can be used also to support the protection of our biodiversity. And then very importantly, the idea of scaling up funding for natural solutions to adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Next one. And this is the last one. Here again is the important point about effectiveness and efficiency. And here I think that the sort of big message is that you need to have both horizontal and vertical coordination to ensure good governance and planning of resources, particularly where it's limited. And then the other important point is the point about partnerships and how important that is, not just at the international level, but certainly also national and subnational levels, and going with that, the question of building capacity. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thanks, Ingrid, for that very useful information. And yeah, I think you mentioned that there's a lot more to this. So yeah, just a call to anyone on the webinar who are interested in learning more about this, please do get in touch with us. So our final speaker is Ms. Kovi Brandt. She, as I mentioned earlier, is unfortunately not able to join us now, but we are going to play a recording of input from this morning. So please do enjoy. I'm going to ask my colleague Patricia if you can then start that recording for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you very much to our team in the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre for putting together this webinar. I think we're only scratching the surface here when we talk about finance and nature, and a lot of issues were touched upon, and we would very much like to encourage you to reach to us if you want to delve with us deeper into it. Nakara is a renowned and very respected scientist in the environmental and biodiversity space, but she's fast, as you can see, also learning to become a finance expert and understand the language of the finance world. And this is what many of us have to do in the biodiversity and nature and altogether the environmental space. We need to talk the language of financiers. We need to understand what our colleagues in the insurance industry, in the banks, in the ODA world, what they would consider as bankable and investable projects, because our cities know what they need to do. Our cities fundamentally are at the coalface of service delivery, and they can do it with nature or without nature. They can build 1 Paris a week with new infrastructure, because that's what's happening in the world today. They can use old methodology or hard infrastructure, or they can think out of the box and think about blue-green infrastructure, think about biophilic solutions, think about new ways of doing things in harmony with nature. But for those things to be funded and investable and for them to be able to sell that to investors and their own national governments, they need very strong business cases and the arguments. And therefore, they need to talk the language of these constituencies. And that's why we in ICLEI and across those of us that support cities and subnational governments, we are skilling ourselves up very rapidly to be able to talk to and bring these sectors closer to those of our constituency of local and subnational governments. So these dialogues and unlikely partnerships are absolutely key to get the momentum and the scale of change that is needed today to get that to actually materialize right here on the ground in our cities and towns. And I think it's I don't know if all those people who have access to financing realize how much the economies, the local economies and even the national economies of countries really depend on nature. If we take, for an example, about a third of the world's 105 largest cities, including Los Angeles, New York, Rome, and Tokyo, depend directly on protected forests for a significant share of their drinking water. So, it may not be that apparent, but it's there, it's inherent. These ecosystems that underpin our livelihoods, our economies, in our cities, in our towns, and our city-region in interactions, that is fundamental. And we see that these ecosystems are degrading, and some are very close to reaching tipping points or points of no return, where we will not be able to restore them to create the same type of value for us. So it's very important to value nature for what it is. It's still very important to keep on making the argument with political leaders, but also with captains of industry, with civil society, and a whole of society and whole of government networks to understand really what the value of nature is. Yesterday, we celebrated a world without nature on World Wildlife Day, and a number of us, including WWF and many of our partners, ICLEI as well, we just deleted the nature elements from our logos. And I would encourage you, go to Twitter and go and have some fun and explore how we did it. It's very, very hard hitting. But the reality is that if we take nature away, if we try and imagine a world without nature, it's as good as you imagine a world without people, because people will not exist in a world without nature. Yet, nature is not being regarded as something that is likely to be invested in. And if we look at the local level, we've heard about all the international instruments and so on from Nakara. We need to unpack it more. But let's just quickly, for a minute, look at what a city can already do. Cities can already, and many are, evaluating in many ways with hard evaluations and soft evaluations, evaluate what they get out of nature. And this pandemic, COVID-19, which we are still living through, has shown us how we feel when we are deprived of accessing nature. We have never, as a human race, been so deprived of being in nature, being with nature, engaging with nature on a daily basis. For our health and our well-being, our cultural practices, our spiritual and mental state of mind, our creativity, our energy, and our just our human beings, being a full human person, we have seen that we really need nature. We depend on nature, and we almost want to say that in a rights-based approach, don't people have a right to nature in their lives, even if they live in the very heart of a city center, in the CBD of the largest city? We are talking about a 15-minute city. I mean, Paris is talking about a 15-minute city in terms of being able to get mobile and connect across the city, but also connecting with nature. And that is almost, I would say, a fundamental right that is standing up like never before. And Ryan, I see that our time is up, but let me just end by saying that we have a golden opportunity here now to make a stronger argument than ever before that no city, and therefore also no country, will flourish and come out of the pandemic stronger and better if it's not with nature and in harmony with nature. And let's end with the thought of the UN Secretary General when Antonio Guterres, when he addressed us in December last year on the state of the planet. He was saying we are waging war against nature, humanity. But because humanity has gotten us to where we are in terms of this broken relationship with nature, it is also us, humans, that can fix this and set us on a new path. And we see many cities and regions absolutely committed to doing that. Many have joined platforms like Cities with Nature, where they learn and share and inspire each other and commit publicly and then report on their commitments in terms of what they are doing with nature and for nature. Not only for nature, but for the well-being of humanity and the very survival of humanity. So I strongly would say that let's talk about what could come next as a measure of a well-lived life and quality of life. It's no longer GDP. GDP is no longer the instrument that we can measure our happiness, our well-being, and our quality of life now and for future generations. And then a very, very last point, just to say that we need to integrate agendas. The agenda around health, biodiversity, nature, food, nutrition, quality of life, social equity, inclusion, and of course, climate change. These are not separate agendas, and these cannot be addressed in isolation from one another. And that is why we also, like UNEP, are saying loudly and clearly, and our cities at the forefront are practicing loudly and clearly, integrated solutions, integrated approaches. And this is what we need to do when we tackle this new decade of ecosystem restoration and the decade of action on attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Ryan, and thank you very much for everybody who have joined us today.
Great. So we send a very big thank you to Kobe in her absence. I think those were some very great insights. Some scary as well. I think I can probably speak on behalf of a lot of people here to say that imagining a world without nature is a scary sight. And I think that's definitely why we are all here, is to try and prevent that. And I think also just tying in with the question I see in the Q&A with regards to ICLEI's partnering with national governments. I think that is definitely the case, and I'll maybe ask Ingrid to maybe elaborate a little bit on that, particularly around the post-2020 work. But I think definitely there is a real need for us to obviously work beyond just sub-national governments, which includes not just national governments, but private sector and business, as Kobe alluded to. And I think Ingrid, in one of your slides as well, you alluded to the need for a vertical and horizontal integration approach to securing nature in cities. So yeah, we have a little bit of short time for question and answers. We are running slightly out of time, but that's the only live question I've seen. So Ingrid, I'm going to ask you to quickly respond.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. And yes, I saw that question. It's a very good question. And indeed we do in different ways. It just depends on what part of the world we're working in and what the particular issue is. But we engage with national governments through maybe a specific project. For example, we have a biodiversity mainstreaming project that's being implemented in Tanzania, India, Brazil, and hopefully soon also in other parts of the world. we've got a few other countries lined up if the donor funding comes through. And one of the components of this particular mainstreaming project is looking precisely at the issue of financing and investment cases and sort of bankable projects that focus on nature-based solutions at the local level, and what are the right financing mechanisms. So that's just one example. We also engage with national governments through different programs that we run. For example, we have the TAP program, which is actually not specifically biodiversity focused. It's more about climate, but that's basically a sort of a platform where cities can submit applications, funding applications for climate actions, and then we sort of play a support role in terms of trying to match that with funders. Sometimes it's national, sometimes it's international, or donors or DFIs or whatever the case may be. And then also at a policy level, obviously engaging with national governments around specific policy mechanisms, and in many cases these do revolve around finance issues. So there's a variety of different ways in which we engage with national governments. And if we do work in a country, for example, doesn't matter where it is in the world, if we have a project, it's always in collaboration and with the blessing, as it were, of the national government. So there's a variety of ways in which we do, and it's very important. You know, we're a great advocate for this concept of multi-level governance or vertical integration or horizontal integration. The two in the CBD jargon, we talk about the whole of government, and in the climate space, it's more sort of multi-level, multilateral and multi-level governance. So yeah, very important point, and yes, definitely, Italy does work with national governments.
Great, thanks for that, Ingrid. I don't see any more live questions or any hands raised, but as always, we encourage all participants, if there are any questions or points of clarity, or if you just want to get in touch and involved, please do reach out to us. We are always, we welcome, you know, all inputs and welcome to partner with like-minded people, of course, as well. So we also cognizant of the fact that some of our attendees have just woken up and started their workday. Some might be ready to go to bed, so we're not going to keep you much longer than we really should. But just to reiterate, as Kobe mentioned in her talk a little bit, you know, Cities with Nature is a recognized platform by the SCBD as the platform for local and subnational governments to join and really to report on the work and achievements that they have around nature within cities. So really we encourage, as always, all cities and partners of cities to join Cities with Nature and come on board this great initiative. And so if you do want to learn more about the Cities with Nature initiative, there is the website. I think Tamlin might share the link in the chat as well. But great initiative for cities and their partners to get involved and share what they are doing, and of course also learn from other cities across the world. So a really great initiative, and we really pride ourselves at Cities with Nature and to continue the improvement thereof. So please do check it out. And with that, we've come to the end of our webinar. Just a big thanks to our speakers for availing themselves and providing great insights, and of course to our attendees for availing yourselves and joining us for this webinar. So as I mentioned, the next installment will happen on the 1st of April. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to attendees and also be uploaded to our various platforms. So with that, again, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Keep well and keep safe, and goodbye.